Today on The Nation Speaks, the pandemic took a lot of people out of the labor force. There are many reasons why, including substance abuse. Economist Jeremy Greenwood and colleagues found that opioid abuse may have had a significant impact on keeping people off the job. Then in America Q&A, we ask, how do you feel about unelected officials having more power than elected officials? Next, social justice math. California will soon have a new framework to guide K-12 math teachers. Critics say it focuses too much on politics and not enough on algebra. We hear all about it from Ze'ev Wurman, a former senior advisor to the U.S. Department of Education. Then in our second America Q&A, we ask if you think mass student loan forgiveness is fair to people who've already paid their debt. Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. Even if you don't read the news, you've seen the signs. Help wanted. Businesses are facing a tough time hiring staff. During the pandemic, workforce participation was low and it still hasn't fully recovered. According to the latest figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are currently 6.1 million job openings in America. So where are all the workers? There are a lot of explanations. A big one for women is that many had to stay home to look after kids in Zoom school. Some people figured out how to work for themselves. Others are holding out for jobs with higher pay or more flexibility. Some people stopped work to reskill, and some analysts say that low rates of legal immigration are to blame. But there's one very interesting phenomenon uncovered by analysts at the National Bureau of Economic Research: substance abuse. We're joined now by Jeremy Greenwood, a professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania and co-author of the very revealing paper, Substance Abuse During the Pandemic, Implications for Labor Force Participation. Jeremy, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me on The Nation Speaks.
This is such an interesting topic because it's frankly not something I think was on anybody's radar in terms of explaining this phenomenon. Although we've certainly heard stories about increased substance abuse during the pandemic. What were the high-level findings? What did you discover in this research?
Well, in the research, we discovered that during the COVID-19 crisis, opioid use spiked, and also along with opioid use, death spiked too. And it turns out, as you might expect, that opioid abusers or addicts tend to have a much lower labor force participation rate than non-abusers do. So then we thought it would be interesting to see how much the increase in opioid use contributed to the fall in labor force participation during the pandemic. We found that increased opioid use accounted for roughly 25% of the drop in labor force participation, which is a pretty big number. And the drop was bigger for the non-college educated versus the college educated, as you might expect.
25%, that is a huge number.
That's 20, just to be clear, it's 25% of the drop. The lower end of the range would be 9%. So the range spans from 9% up to over 26%.
And to what extent has this recovered in the last, I think your study period ended June 2021. So to what extent has that recovered as the labor force has somewhat recovered?
Well, for the college educated, they've almost fully recovered. But for the non-college educated, they've only recovered about half of the drop before pre-pandemic levels.
I know you're a macroeconomist, but do you have any hypothesis or explanation for why there'd be such a big difference between those two groups?
I don't. So one of the most obvious explanations would be that, maybe the non-college educated, they have a different types of employment. So, with respect to drug use, people that actually do physical labor, for instance, they're more likely to have back pain and other types of pain than someone that has a desk job like me.
In your study, you didn't just look at opioid use, you also looked at methamphetamines and alcohol. First of all, what did you find with relation to substance abuse for those two substances, and why did you pick those two? Was there anything else that you considered?
Yeah, well, like you said, we considered opioids, meth, and alcohol. So obviously before the pandemic, people died from opioid use, they died from meth use, and they died from alcohol. So again, what you have to do is you have to look in the trend of deaths in opioids, alcohol, or meth, and then you try to estimate the difference from the trend, and that's called excess deaths. So for instance, excess deaths for opioids between April 20 and June 21 were about 15,000 people. Excess deaths for meth were about 3,000 people, and excess deaths from alcohol were about 8,000 people.
Recently, a photo of a 9th grade math class worksheet in Missouri went viral because it included questions from poet Maya Angelou's autobiography about being sexually abused and her sex work. The questions were totally unrelated to math. The school superintendent responded with an apology, saying the teacher got the worksheet from a lesson plan sharing website and the assignment's been removed from the course. Case closed. But as the story got reported, the incident sparked conversation about what is and isn't appropriate to teach a math class. Well, California is in the process of revising its mathematics framework, a nearly 1,000-page document which provides guidance on how to teach K-12 math in public schools. The public commenting period ends May 16th, and our guest has been commenting quite a lot, including co-writing an open letter to California state leadership condemning the framework. The letter was signed by over 1,200 professionals, mostly university-level professors in STEM subjects, science, tech, engineering, and math. Since the letter, some of the elements of the framework have been revised, but our guest, Ze'ev Wurman, says the core of his criticism still stands. We sat down earlier with him to discuss what California math class could look like. With us is Ze'ev Wurman, a former senior advisor in the U.S. Department of Education. He was also on the committee that wrote an earlier version of this framework, and he was a commissioner on California's Academic Standards Commission. Ze'ev, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So let's start high level with what your objections are to this framework. In your open letter that you wrote, you said that California is on the verge of politicizing K-12 math in a potentially dangerous way, and that the proposed framework wouldn't affect demathematize math. So explain those to us. What did you mean by that?
I'll try to. Basically, the framework is flawed in three different dimensions. The first one is that it indeed politicizes mathematics. It injects social justice, it injects socio-political conscience, it injects various ideas that come from social justice rather than talking about math. So there is a de-emphasis of the math itself and emphasis on political, socio-political issues. To give you an example, the framework has like 13 chapters. Only 3 of them actually deal with the mathematical standards. All the rest is about how to treat, what subject of the example should be, how social political issues should be raised by the teachers, and so on. So this is the first problem. The second problem is that when it does talk about pedagogy of teaching mathematics, is basically departing from confirmed research. Confirmed research is very clear that expository teaching is much more effective than discovery learning. When you let the students inquire a working group and think on their own what can be the solution, because that can take a long time and can leave a lot of students with wrong impressions, wrong ideas that are very difficult to correct by the teacher later on in a few moments of summary that he gives in the class. The third part is that frameworks have to be based on current and confirmed research. That's in the law, in California Education Code. Yet the references, the support, the scientific support supposedly for this framework is lacking. It's mostly citing research that has been unpublished, not peer-referenced. Even those that are published in second and third tier journals. Somewhere, if you look at the rating of those journals, they are like in the hundreds and even thousands. So those are the 3 separate issues. All of them are very prominent in this framework, which make the framework essentially a problem.